Welcome everybody, thanks for tuning in today. We're going to be doing a little bit of before and after runs and show you guys why it is so important to have your suspension set up properly. We're going to drop into a pretty steep little chute with a very sharp catch berm at the bottom. Over the years from erosion, there's now actually two little stair step drops about this big into the berm, and I've got not nearly enough air pressure in this fork. So I reset my travel indicator at the top of both of those, and as you can see, I used up almost all the travel. And there wasn't really any major compressions or hits, so to say. So essentially, as soon as I came off that first roll in, the fork just compresses and dives. That shifts your body weight forward. It unweights the back end. So one, you don't have as much brake control. Two, you got a lot more weight on your bars, so you're not able to handle and control and weight the bike properly. Then I came into the second one, out of balance, and then it was right into that berm. Most likely, we'll see in slow-mo, with that fork still way too compressed, and then it just squished down even more in that berm. Another reason that having the proper air pressure in your suspension is really important is not those single individual hits or those big compressions in corners, but fast repetitive hits. So if you look right over my shoulder here, you'll see that there's like a kind of a log step down that lands into a bunch of consecutive roots. And then after you get a bunch of those roots, there's another small drop into a compression, actually two hard braking compressions where just from people braking, it's cleared dirt out. It's important that you have the right spring rate or air pressure because it's going to allow the fork and shock to rebound, come up out of the travel, so that way you actually get the suspension that you've paid for and need to handle these hits at speed. If you have too little air, too soft a spring rate, or your rebound is too slow, what's going to happen is you're going to come off that first little log drop and you're going to land, you're going to be in your travel, the bike will never be able to recover, get out of that travel, so you're essentially going to be riding through all that stuff with this much suspension instead of that much. We're approaching this drop with proper air pressure, you're going to land and have plenty of travel for more hits. So as you can see, folks, there's a lot that goes into properly setting up the suspension on your bike, and today we're going to dive into a couple of key topics. Most importantly today, we're going to be discussing air pressure, which is also known as spring rate in these air-sprung suspension components, and what they're going to do to affect the ride height, stability, and safety of you on the trails. As you saw in some of those initial kind of test runs where we ran way too soft of air for the terrain, or for my rider weight, I should say, the suspension is way too low in the travel, and effectively what you do when you have too much sag or not enough air in your suspension is you lower the ride height of the bike. And air, over time, it will leave these sealed chambers here in these suspension products. So they're not going to leave at the exact same rate or percentage. So if you know your fork lost 10 pounds and the rear shock lost 5, then all of a sudden your weight distribution, the geometry that it is designed to have is all compromised and is going to affect your bike and how you ride. So by having too much air pressure, you're going to be bouncing over the top of terrain. It's going to feel a little bit skittish, a little bit loose. It might not get the traction or the compliance that you want. It's also going to beat you up. It's going to be stiffer on your feet, more tiring on your hands. You're not going to be able to brake as well, hold lines in loose terrain because that bike just won't be settling into the travel. And as you saw in our examples, too soft means you're blowing through, striking pedals, steepening your head tube angle, and everything that comes with that. Proper air pressure depends on each bike. Pretty good range to start with for most bikes is that 25 to 35% range. I'd say 30 is a pretty safe bet, 28 to 30%. They will have an optimized setting, whether it's the stroke length in millimeters. When you set that ring, when you set your travel, you can measure how many millimeters that ring's at, and that will give you a number, or they'll do a percent. Obviously, if you've got a millimeter measurement, you can just get some calipers or a pretty detailed tape measure and figure that out pretty nicely. So rear, 30% is probably a pretty safe spot to experiment with for most bikes. Up front, there's a lot of schools of thought here, but 20% is kind of pretty well accepted estimation for sag. From there, once you get into that roughly 20%, 30% sag, go ride the bike and see what you think. If you feel like it's a little bit of a rougher ride and the ring's only getting about this high on a pretty aggressive or gnarly downhill run, then you have too much air or too much compression. So based on my weight, the chart says I should be at 93 pounds. Jordy, the main man at Fox, behind all the fastest World Cup racers, says always double check. So I'm gonna be putting this fork up to about 102 PSI, and I'm gonna see how that feels. I had about 85 in it when I just did that, so it's 15-ish, well, 12 PSI. It's pretty notable difference. Do not like the diving, do not like riding low in the travel, so that's where volume reducers come into play. We made a really awesome video on that. If you missed it, check it out. We were at 102 PSI. I'm actually at 104, so I'll be okay with that. Now I'm going to check my compression. Again, high speed and low speed do not mean how fast you are going. It means the velocity of the impact to the fork. The compression, usually on a fork, right, like this Fox here, you've got high speed and low speed circuits. You could roll into a curb at 3 miles an hour, and that impact would be a high speed compression impact, whereas you could be going 25 miles an hour and just grab the front brake, and all that shifting of your body weight is a low speed compression circuit. So those are the two differences there, and something that I know a lot of people struggle with is high speed versus low speed. You know, brands have gotten a lot better of isolating each of those circuits, and what we would say is a good thing to try to think about is you don't want to be riding the air spring. What we mean is you don't want to have the compression all the way open and your only suspension performance is coming from the air spring. And you don't want to just be riding the controlled circuit of your compression. And what that means is you have way too little air and you're just relying on all this damping from the compression circuit to keep that fork up in travel. You want to let both of these elements work together to maximize the performance on your bike. Low speed compression, I think, is where you could have a little bit more personal preference, something that's a little bit more terrain dependent. If you're riding somewhere like in the video that is very steep, you're going to want to have more low speed compression because all your body weight and heavy braking is going to be pushing energy and mass into that fork, and you don't want that thing to just be sucking down into the travel because you're steepening your head tube angle, all the things we've talked about, lowering the ride height, etc. We've primarily been talking about the fork because that, in a very steep situation, is going to be probably one of the more important components to keeping you safe and upright and in a good position. But I would say the rear shock is also very important. If you're riding too low in the shock's stroke, I say you have too much sag, bottom bracket, your cranks are going to be hitting, putting your feet and body in danger as you ride by tall obstacles. Having a good balance feel is definitely going to be key. So we're just topping this thing back off at 200 PSI and make sure that we're all happy with that. And for the record, I am 5'11" and I weigh about 172 pounds, probably with helmet and all my gear on, probably about 175 to 76, depending on how many donuts I ate on the way to the trailhead. We'll see how we do this one. Let's head back up and try it again. Everything about that felt so much better. I felt confident. I felt like I could come in and kind of nose off that little rock drop. I came into the berm. Bike was balanced. I don't know if it looked any different to you guys, but it felt way different on the bike. So after you've gotten your air pressures pretty close, your compression set up, we can talk about rebound as well. Rebound is going to be personal preference to a large extent. However, there are some no-nos that you don't want to have it riding like a pogo stick, and you don't want to have the thing riding to where it's just sucked down into the travel and it can't extend. If you ride off of a curb seated, you know, a lot of people would do the old thing, you ride off the curb, let the bike bounce up and then settle. That's a decent way you can kind of get, at least in the ballpark, you can sort of get calibrated by just pressing on the seat and letting the bike bounce up, and it should return quickly under your hands, not pushing your hand, and it shouldn't be sucking slowly back up as your hands are already at the top, you know, so you want that thing to be pretty quick. Same with the fork. You want to be able to push down on that bar, and you don't want it to push your hands up, but you don't want your hands to be pulling the bars or feeling like you're waiting for that fork to come back up. Ride height, safety, ground clearance, maintaining geometry, all very important things that are going to help ensure you guys stay safe, that you can ride harder, faster, and look farther down the trail at what's coming, rather than trying to, you know, manage these big hits that your suspension could be eating up if things were set up just a little bit better. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that and got some good tips out of it. Please be sure to hit that subscribe button, as we are really trying to grow our channel this summer. It would mean a lot to us if you hit that button. Leave a comment down below if you've got any questions or you have any suspension tips of your own. Thank you guys, and we'll hope to see you out on the trails.